The chill of the evening air outside the sterile, temporary apartment didn't match the burning sickness pooling in my stomach. I had spent the last 6 months living in a suspended state, the ghost of my marriage to Daniel lingering in every beige corner of the sublet, the scent of the cheap carpet smelling like defeat. We had been married for 8 years, fighting a miserable, slow-motion legal battle for the last 2. I thought I knew what pain was. I thought I had reached the limit of my endurance. I was wrong. It was late, the kind of Friday night where the silence felt loud. I dropped my briefcase by the door, the clatter startling, and kicked off my heels. My mind was already spinning over the details of next week's deposition. Daniel's lawyer, Mr. Thorne, was aggressive, and I was holding on to hope by a thread, fighting tooth and nail to keep the house and salvage some semblance of the life we had built. As I reached for the light switch in the small kitchen, I noticed an envelope lying on the entryway table, a thick, legal manila envelope sealed with the unmistakable, slightly obnoxious crimson wax stamp used only by the firm of Thorne and Associates. My heart leaped, not with anticipation, but with dread. Why was this here? All legal correspondence was supposed to go to my attorney, Mr. Davies. Thorne would never send anything directly to me. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It felt heavy, final. The address sticker was printed meticulously, my name centered above the current sublet address. I flipped it over. The return address confirmed it, Thorne and Associates. A wave of dizziness hit me. I tore open the seal, the paper rasping loudly in the quiet space. Inside were several stacks of documents held together by fat black clips. The first page I pulled free, the signature page, slammed the breath out of my lungs. It was the final decree, the judgment. My eyes scrolled down the official language, blurring past the terms I recognized: irreconcilable differences, asset division, finalization. But it wasn't the wording that stopped me. It was the date. It had been finalized 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, while I was preparing for the deposition that apparently never mattered. I sank onto the narrow wooden bench by the door, the flimsy paperwork rustling like dead leaves. This couldn't be right. Mr. Davies had assured me we were still negotiating. Daniel was still fighting me on the equity split. How could the judge have signed off on this? Then I looked closer, focusing on the signature line that read, in bold print, Clara Henderson. The signature beneath the line was elegant, too elegant. My own signature had become a hurried scrawl over the years, marked by exhaustion and impatience. This signature, however, was beautiful, perfectly formed, slightly larger than life, a signature that belonged to someone confident, someone meticulous. A slow, cold horror began to seep into my bones, replacing the panic. I leaned closer, pulling the page up toward the harsh overhead light. I knew this signature, not because it was mine, it wasn't, but because I had seen it since I was 6 years old, doodled on school notebooks, signed onto birthday cards, etched into the frosting of cakes. There was a tiny, telltale flaw, a microscopic signature tick that belonged to only one person besides me in the whole world, a mark our mother had always told us to correct, the unnecessary, decorative little loop she added to the base of the capital C. My sister, Olivia. My body went instantly rigid, the blood rushing from my extremities. Olivia, she had signed the papers. She had signed my name. She had finalized my divorce. The implication was staggering, massive, criminal, legal fraud, identity theft. But why? Why would she do this? Olivia was the picture of supportive sisterhood. She was the one who drove me to appointments, brought me casseroles, and sat through endless tearful evenings assuring me Daniel was a monster and I deserved better. She was my confidant, the keeper of my secrets, the one person I had trusted implicitly through this agonizing public disintegration of my life. I frantically flipped through the stack. There were papers detailing the asset division, the terms of which were far more favorable to Daniel and anything Mr. Davies had advised me to accept. The house was his entirely. The retirement accounts were split unevenly. My signature, or Olivia's flawless imitation of it, was on every single page requiring my assent. The forgery was so good, so painstaking. Only someone who had spent decades observing my handwriting, someone intimate with the casual sweep of my pen, could have pulled it off. Olivia and I had shared a childhood bedroom for 15 years. We had done our homework side by side, mimicking each other's styles, signing each other's permission slips when we were teenagers. A sound escaped my throat, a harsh, ragged gasp that was half scream, half sob. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a calculated, deep-seated act of sabotage that had dismantled my life and handed my future equity over to the man I was fighting. I stood up too fast, the room tilting violently. The paper slid from my lap and scattered across the entryway floor, the final decree catching the light like a tombstone. She signed my divorce papers. The questions hammered at me, cold and relentless. How did she get access to Daniel's lawyer? Did she know Daniel? No, they barely tolerated each other. Daniel always found Olivia too demanding, too intense. Yet the document came from Thorne and Associates. That meant at the very least Daniel's legal team was complicit, or at least one person in it was, and Olivia must have convinced them she was me. I staggered toward the kitchen counter, needing an anchor. My reflection in the dark window stared back, pale, wild-eyed, completely unmoored. The initial shock gave way to a towering, white-hot fury, so intense it felt physical, like a massive internal organ seizing up. I grabbed my car keys, the movement jerky and uncoordinated. There was no time for careful thought, no space for seeking advice from Mr. Davies. All the rational centers of my brain had shut down. All that remained was the primal urge to confront her, to demand an explanation that I already knew would never suffice. I needed to see her face when I showed her the sea. I needed to watch her perfect composure shatter. My sister lived about 20 minutes away, in the quiet, tree-lined suburb where we grew up. The drive was a blur of flashing streetlights and choked-back sobs. The entire world outside the car felt muted, unreal. My focus was narrowed solely to the small stack of papers vibrating on the passenger seat, the physical evidence of her crime. I replayed the last few months in my head, searching for the crack in the facade. Olivia's excessive availability, her constant, gentle probing about the details of the negotiations, details I had foolishly shared, believing she was just concerned. Her sudden interest in how Thorne and Associates structured their settlement proposals. I remembered telling her, just last month, about my signature being on file at the bank and how hard it would be for Daniel to prove I was signing away assets under duress. Had she been planning this the whole time? Since when? Before the divorce started? Before the marriage even ended? The betrayal wasn't just in the fraud. It was in the performance. It was in every comfortable hand squeeze, every judgmental comment about Daniel, every single time she told me, "You deserve so much better, Clara. Let me help you." She wasn't helping me. She was destroying me. I pulled up to her house, the engine still running. It was 11:30 p.m. Lights were on in her living room, the soft glow spilling onto the meticulously manicured lawn. She was likely settled in, watching television, enjoying the peaceful quiet of a Friday night, unaware that the foundation of her entire life was about to be rocked to its core. I slammed the car door shut, the sound echoing through the neighborhood. I didn't bother to knock. I just jammed my key, the spare she gave me, claiming I should have access in case of emergency, into the lock and pushed the door open. "Olivia!" My voice was raw, unfamiliar, stripped bare of civility. She was indeed in the living room, curled up on her white sectional, scrolling through her phone, a half-empty glass of red wine on the coffee table. She looked up, startled, her perfect blonde hair catching the light. "Clara? God, what time is it? What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." She started to rise, concern etched into her features, the practiced performance beginning immediately. I took 2 steps into the room, holding the folded packet of papers out like a venomous snake. The fury was a tidal wave now, crashing over any semblance of control. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely keep the papers steady. "Don't you dare pretend, Olivia. Don't you dare look at me with that innocent face." "Pretend what? Clara, what is going on? Did Daniel send you something awful?" She tried to move toward me, her brow furrowed in manufactured worry. I recoiled, taking a step back. Keep your distance, you sickening fraud." I threw the papers onto the pristine white rug, scattering them at her feet. She stared down at the documents, her face finally, fractionally losing its composure. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a stark, unnatural pallor. "Pick them up, Olivia. Pick them up and look at the signature line," I spat, the effort making my throat burn. She hesitated, her eyes flickering nervously from the documents to my face, then back to the wine glass. She didn't move. "Pick them up," I screamed, the sound tearing out of me so loudly it vibrated in the glass windows. The sheer volume was fueled by months of stress and the sudden, crippling weight of her treachery. She finally knelt, slowly, cautiously, as if the papers might bite her. She picked up the final decree, her fingers brushing against the crisp legal paper. She didn't even need to read the content. Her eyes went straight to the signature. A terrible silence descended, broken only by my ragged breathing. I watched her face, searching for regret, for panic, for anything that resembled the sister I thought I knew. I saw none of it, only cold, calculating recognition, quickly veiled by a mask of shame. "I can explain," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Explain?" I laughed, a hideous, broken sound. "Explain how you committed felony fraud? Explain how you stole my future and handed my assets over to my husband? No. Explain this," I demanded, leaning down, my voice dropping to a dangerous hiss as I pointed a shaking finger at the tiny, familiar loop on the C. "Explain how you forgot to fix the loop that Mom always yelled at you about when we were signing book reports in the 5th grade." Olivia's facade completely crumbled then. Her eyes filled, not with tears of remorse, but with a deep, bitter anger that shocked me more than the forgery itself. She didn't apologize. She didn't deny it. She just held the document, defeated. "I did it for you, Clara," she said, her voice strained but firm. "It had to be done." "It had to be done?" I repeated, the incredulity momentarily overriding the rage. "To make me penniless? To sign away 8 years of my life against my express wishes? You had no right, Olivia. You are not my lawyer, you are not my spouse, and you sure as hell aren't my sister." "Daniel agreed to these terms." "They were better than you would have gotten if you had dragged this out for another year," she cried, rising to her feet, finally matching my volume. "You were going to lose everything anyway, Clara. You are terrible in negotiations. You were weak." The insult stung, not because it was true, but because it exposed her true nature, judgment, control, and condescension masked as care. "So you decided to become my executioner? You decided to take my name and seal my fate? Whose side are you on, Olivia?" She took a sharp breath, her hands clenching at her sides. "I'm on the side of reality. You were clinging to a dead marriage in an empty house. Daniel was done, and you couldn't accept it. He came to me, Clara. He came to me months ago, frustrated, seeing how you were dragging his name through the mud, and he said, She stopped herself, biting her lip. He said what, Olivia? Tell me every vile, disgusting detail. He said he was worried about you, she finished, a lie weak and transparent. He was worried about your instability, and he needed a way to make it clean. He needed finality. The mention of Daniel sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. Daniel? Working with Olivia? They hated each other. This was the one thing that made no sense. You're lying. Daniel would never work with you. You two couldn't be in the same room without sniping at each other. This is about you. This is always about you, isn't it? What did you get out of this, Olivia? Did Daniel pay you? Did he promise you something? Her eyes narrowed, the last vestiges of forced victimhood evaporating. The look she gave me was cold, hard, and terrifyingly unfamiliar. It's not about money, Clara. It's about balance. You always had everything handed to you, didn't you? The perfect job, the perfect husband, the perfect life. While I stood here, the dependable, boring sister, watching you fail to appreciate any of it. So you destroyed it? I whispered, feeling the strength drain from my legs. The realization was heavier than any financial loss. This wasn't about the papers, it was about years of buried resentment. I corrected it, she insisted, taking a challenging step forward. I ended the suffering, and I protected Daniel. Protected Daniel? The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Why would you protect him? Why does Daniel matter to you? Because, she said, her voice dropping again, this time laced with a chilling mixture of triumph and cruelty. Because Daniel and I have been aligned on this for a long time, Clara, longer than you think. My mind raced back to every dinner, every holiday, every shared family vacation. Had they been plotting this whole time? Had they been looking at me, the wife, the sister, as an obstacle to be managed? No, I shook my head, my voice cracking. No, you're trying to hurt me now. You're trying to make this worse. I'm telling you the truth, she said, her eyes boring into mine. The papers you signed, Clara, the ones you thought were just prenuptial agreements, Daniel showed them to me before the wedding. We read them together. We planned this exit strategy years ago. The bottom fell out of my world. Not months, not weeks, years, since before we even said I do. The air felt thin, suffocating. My hands flew to my ears, trying to block out the vile words that were rearranging the entire framework of my reality. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, paralyzing devastation. You stood next to me at my wedding, I managed, the words barely puffs of air. You adjusted my veil. You held my hand and told me I was going to be happy. Olivia gave a bitter, knowing smile. And I meant it, Clara, but happiness sometimes requires intervention. You needed to be freed from him, but you didn't have the strength to do it yourself, so I did it for you and for us. Us? I repeated, my voice rising again, desperate and shrill. There is no us. You are a monster. You are legally, criminally a monster. The confrontation escalated instantly. I took a step toward her, intending to grab her, to shake the answers out of her, when she suddenly flinched back and reached for her phone. Get out of my house, Clara, now, or I'm calling the police, she threatened, her composure finally back, the mask of the calculating manipulator firmly in place. Call them, I screamed. Call them. I'll tell them everything. I'll tell them about the fraud. I'll tell them you signed my life away. You think I'm going to let you get away with this, Olivia? I heard a muffled sound from outside, a dog barking wildly, then footsteps running down the pavement. My voice had been too loud. My screaming had drawn attention. As I stood there trembling, facing the woman who wasn't just my sister, but the architect of my total ruin, the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Every single moment of my marriage, every argument, every tender reconciliation, every legal maneuver had been watched, judged, and ultimately dismantled by her. I picked up the paper she had dropped and clutched them to my chest, the evidence burning through my shirt. I looked at Olivia one last time, her beautiful, cold face now alight with a frightening determination. "You have no idea what you've done," I choked out. "Oh, I think I have a very clear idea," she countered, her voice ice. "And unlike you, Clara, I always finish what I start." I turned and stumbled out of the house, leaving the door wide open. The cold night air hit me, offering no comfort. The sound of a distant police siren was already growing closer. I got into my car, but I didn't drive away immediately. I sat there, staring blankly ahead, the weight of her final confession. We planned this exit strategy years ago, crushing every single memory I held dear. The realization wasn't just that I was divorced and financially crippled. It was that the two people I had trusted most in the world, my husband and my sister, had conspired against me for years, silently participating in a cruel, drawn-out farce. I was never truly married. I was never truly loved. I was simply the subject of a long-term, elaborate con. The truth hadn't just stung, it had poisoned the well of my past, leaving me standing in an empty, echoing void. The wail of the sirens was immediate, sharp, and invasive, slicing through the midnight quiet of the suburban street. Blue and red light began strobing violently, washing over the windshield of my car, turning the inside into a nauseating, pulsing chamber. I should have driven away the moment I left Olivia's door standing open, but I was frozen, trapped by the seismic shift that had just occurred in my reality. We planned this exit strategy years ago. The words echoed, a poisoned mantra dissolving every cherished memory, every snapshot of happiness I thought I had built. The house, the wedding, the hopeful plans, all of it reduced to a long con performance for my benefit. A patrol car slid to a halt directly behind me, its spotlight blinding. I saw the silhouette of an officer emerging from the driver's side, walking toward my window with a slow, deliberate pace that spoke of nuisance call fatigue. I took a shuddering breath, forcing the white-hot fury back down into the cold pit of resolve. Panic would only get me detained. I was holding evidence of a felony. I needed to act like the wronged party, not the hysterical woman the neighbors had reported. I rolled down the window, the blast of cool air a slight relief against my burning skin. "Ma'am, are you all right?" the officer asked, his hand resting near his sidearm, his eyes scanning the interior of my vehicle. "We received a call about a disturbance, sounded like screaming." My voice came out surprisingly steady, flat, and infused with the icy chill of absolute exhaustion. "I am absolutely not all right, officer, but I assure you I am the victim here, not the aggressor." I reached slowly for the packet of documents resting on the passenger seat. I pulled out the final decree and held the signature page up to the flashing light. "My name is Clara Henderson. The woman inside that house, my sister, Olivia, just finalized my divorce without my knowledge or consent. She forged my signature on every single one of these legal documents and filed them 3 weeks ago." The officer's eyes narrowed, shifting from my face to the paper. He didn't take it immediately, trained to be cautious around paper evidence at a domestic call. "Ma'am, that sounds like a civil matter," he said dismissively. "It's not civil," I insisted, fighting the urge to lean forward and scream the truth into his face. "It's criminal. This is identity theft and legal fraud. I have proof of the forgery, and she confessed to it inside." The signature isn't even a good imitation. It has a tiny telltale loop in the C that only she uses. I gestured toward the house. Olivia's front door was still open, a slice of yellow light cutting across the pristine lawn. She called the police because I caught her committing a felony that cost me my entire financial future. If you need a charge, it's criminal conspiracy, and she committed it with my ex-husband. I was screaming because she just confessed to plotting against me for 8 years. The officer hesitated. The intensity in my voice, combined with the official-looking legal document and the open door to the house, gave him pause. This was clearly messy, far beyond a simple noise complaint. He signaled to his partner, who was approaching the front door. "Look, ma'am, if this is a forgery case, you need to file a formal report, and you need to talk to detectives and a lawyer, not us," he said, handing the document back. "But you can't stay here disturbing the peace. We need you to leave the premises immediately." It was the reprieve I needed. I nodded, mechanically turning the key in the ignition. "I understand. I am leaving." As I pulled the car into traffic, watching the red brake lights of the patrol car reflect in my rearview mirror, I realized the documents had saved me. They were physical, unassailable proof that the chaos was justified. They were the key to unlocking the truth, and I was holding them tightly, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. The long drive back to the sublet was a blur of calculated thought, the emotional breakdown postponed, filed away for a time when I could afford the exhaustion. Olivia was a foot soldier in this war, Daniel was the general, and it was Daniel I needed to talk to next. He needed to know that I knew, and I needed to hear the lie he had so carefully constructed. I parked the car in the underground garage of my apartment building and sat there, the engine silent, the darkness absolute. I pulled my phone from my bag. It was 12:45 a.m. I didn't care. I scrolled to Daniel's contact, my thumb hovering over the call button. I had rehearsed this confrontation 100 times in my head during the months of the divorce, but never like this. I was calling not as the wounded wife seeking reconciliation or justice, but as the prey who had just realized she was surrounded by hunters. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice thick with carefully curated sleepiness. "Hello? Clara? What in God's name is wrong? It's almost 1 a.m. "Don't," I warned, the single word sharp enough to cut the silence. "Don't pretend you were asleep. Don't pretend you don't know why I'm calling." The sleepiness evaporated instantly, replaced by a guarded tension. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Is this about the deposition? Because that's next week, and—" "I have the papers, Daniel." I cut him off, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The final decree. Thorne and Associates sent them to my apartment, not Davies, and they are signed." A heartbeat of silence stretched between us, deafening and vast. I heard a slight intake of breath on his end, a barely perceptible hitch that confirmed he was calculating his next move. "Signed? Clara, I don't follow. Mr. Thorne would never." "Stop. The signature isn't mine," I stated plainly. "It's Olivia's. She confessed tonight. She signed every document, Daniel. She admitted that she and you had an exit strategy planned since before the wedding." The admission, spoken aloud to the man who was half of the conspiracy, felt monumental. Now I waited for the expertly executed lie. It came swiftly, smoothly, and laced with just the right amount of feigned outrage. "What? Are you serious, Clara? That lunatic? Oh, God. I knew she was obsessed with controlling your life, but forgery? Jesus Christ." His performance was chilling. He sounded genuinely shocked, immediately redirecting the focus from his own complicity to Olivia's instability. "Don't try to pin this all on her, Daniel," I said, gripping the phone so hard my fingers ached. "I'm not pinning anything. I'm telling you the truth," he retorted. his voice rising in manufactured frustration. "Look, yes, I talked to her, I admit that. Months ago, maybe 6 months ago. She kept calling me, saying she was worried about your emotional state, how volatile you were getting, and how you were dragging this process out just to hurt me. She convinced me that the only way to get you the settlement, the fair settlement, the one we had agreed on verbally, was to get your lawyer out of the picture. She said she could bypass Davies, save us both the legal fees, and talk you into signing the papers once I had them ready." He paused, letting the silence hang, making it sound like he was the reasonable, patient victim of Olivia's overreach. "I told her to stick to the settlement talks, Clara. I told her to facilitate things. I certainly didn't tell her to commit a felony. I assumed she was helping you see reason. This is Olivia going too far. She's mad, Clara. She's always been mad, jealous of everything you had. Why do you think she's been so focused on your divorce? She wanted control. She wanted to prove she was better at managing your life than you were. And now she's done this idiotic criminal thing." His argument was meticulously measured. By conceding the fact that he spoke to her, he preemptively neutralized any future evidence of their shared communication. By framing Olivia as mad and jealous, he successfully painted her as the rogue element, the sole perpetrator of the crime, driven by her own deep-seated pathologies. "I protected Daniel," she had said. Now he was using that protection to throw her under the bus. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, testing the boundaries of his lie, "that Mr. Thorne sent a packet of final, signed legal documents directly to my home, even though his client initiated the divorce, and you had no knowledge that my signature was forged? I am telling you I authorized Thorne to prepare the final settlement based on the terms we discussed with Olivia, who I believed was acting on your behalf to expedite things," Daniel countered, sounding genuinely tired now, but in a weary but honest way. "I have no idea how Thorne allowed a forged signature to go through. Maybe she convinced him she was you in a brief meeting? Maybe she convinced him that your lawyer was incompetent and you were signing off independently? Thorne is aggressive, but he's not stupid, Clara. If she convinced him, she must have been incredibly convincing. This is her madness, not mine. I just wanted this divorce done." His masterful deflection hung in the air. He hadn't denied complicity in the plan to circumvent my attorney, only the explicit act of forgery. He acknowledged the shared goal, finalizing the divorce quickly on his terms, but refused ownership of the means, the felony. And that's when I realized the horrifying truth about Daniel. He wasn't just my ex-husband. He was a master emotional predator. He didn't need to tell Olivia to forge the signature. He just needed to create the scenario, the aggressive time frame, the access to the documents via Thorne, the appeal to Olivia's need for control, and let her deep, toxic jealousy do the rest. He hadn't just used Olivia, he had weaponized her instability. "I see," I finally said, the words hollow. The despair had lifted, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I was facing not just a divorce, not just a betrayal, but a calculated, systemic plot. "Clara, look, don't do anything rash," Daniel continued, sensing my quiet withdrawal. "If Olivia really did this, and frankly, I'm shocked, but knowing her, I'm not surprised, you need to handle it carefully. Don't go to the police. It makes us both look terrible. We can resolve this quietly, maybe use the fraud as leverage to adjust the terms slightly in your favor, and get this properly filed. I don't want to see my ex-wife's sister charged with a felony. It's bad press for both of us." Bad press. That was his focus. Containment, scandal management. He wasn't worried about Olivia. He was worried about the trail leading back to Thorne and Associates, and ultimately back to him. "Goodbye, Daniel," I whispered, and hung up before he could respond. I sat in the dark car for several minutes, the smell of recycled garage air thick and stale. The initial fury at Olivia had been raw and reactive. The confrontation with Daniel, however, had provided a surgical, devastating insight into the true nature of the conspiracy. Daniel was not just complicit, he was the primary manipulator. And he was still trying to manipulate me now, urging me to focus my energy and legal action on the easier target, my sister. He wanted the fraud contained, the true extent of the years-long planning kept hidden, and the divorce finalized, albeit slightly amended. He wanted the narrative to be, crazy sister went rogue to help her stressed-out ex-brother-in-law. But I was no longer the exhausted, emotional wife he had relied on to be too weak to fight. I was the person holding the physical proof that my entire life had been a well-orchestrated lie. I took the stairs up to my sublet, the cheap carpet feeling unfamiliar under my feet. I didn't turn on the kitchen light. I went straight to the desk and laid the documents out under the harsh glare of the single lamp. The final decree, signed by Olivia in my name, stared back at me. The betrayal was now doubled, marital and familial. My husband had calculated my emotional destruction, and my sister had volunteered to sign the death certificate. My body was still shaking slightly, a residual tremor from the evening's events, but my mind was perfectly clear. I wasn't going to accept Daniel's deflection. I wasn't going to let him turn this into a domestic issue I handled quietly with a minor settlement adjustment. If they had been planning this for years, if they had annotated the prenup before the wedding, if they had successfully filed a fraudulent divorce decree, then every single interaction with them for nearly a decade had been built on a foundation of malice and deceit. I would not let them win the war by sacrificing their pawn. I opened my laptop and pulled up the contact information for Mr. Davies, my divorce attorney. But Daniel was right. This wasn't Davies' specialty anymore. Davies handled asset division. This was now a case for criminal defense, litigation, and fraud nullification. I searched for the most aggressive, respected law firm specializing in complex financial fraud in the state. I pulled up the website for Sterling and Finch. I didn't care about the retainer fee. I cared about justice. I drafted a concise, professional email summarizing the situation: identity theft, forgery of a legal decree, and potential collusion between the ex-spouse and a relative. I attached a scanned PDF of the signature page as proof. I added a single, resolute sentence at the end of the email. I require immediate consultation. I intend to file criminal charges against my sister, and I need to know how to nullify the entire divorce proceeding based on irrefutable fraud. I sent the email just before 1:30 a.m. The initial chaos was over. The deflection had been noted. Now the quiet, focused war began. I was finally fighting for myself, and I was holding all the cards. I would start by exposing the forgery, but I wouldn't stop until I knew exactly how deep Daniel and Olivia's shared history went and what they had truly plotted against me years ago. The truth, no matter how crushing, was my only weapon now. The adrenaline that had protected me the night before wore off around 6 o'clock in the morning, leaving behind a deep, seismic ache that wasn't just physical exhaustion, but the weight of absolute, unassailable truth. I hadn't slept, merely staring at the ceiling of the temporary sublet, charting the coordinates of my collapse and subsequent rebuilding. The response from Sterling and Finch was already waiting in my inbox. They were efficient, ruthless, and terrifyingly expensive. Miss Vera Sterling, the partner, requested an immediate meeting at 10 a.m., noting that the circumstances I described, a fraudulently filed divorce decree signed by a sibling collaborator, were highly unusual and legally compelling. By 9:45 a.m., I was sitting in the high-rise offices of Sterling and Finch, feeling utterly insignificant against the backdrop of polished chrome, imported marble, and the unnerving silence of true financial power. This was not the comfortable wood-paneled office of Mr. Davies, where we discussed shared assets and visitation schedules. This was the arena where fortunes were won and criminal liabilities were mitigated or deployed. Miss Sterling entered the room precisely at 10. She was a woman in her late 40s, impeccably tailored in severe charcoal gray, with an analytical gaze that seemed to calculate not just my emotional state, but the exact value of my latent rage. There was no sympathy in her eyes, only strategy, and that absence of pity was profoundly comforting. "Miss Henderson," she greeted, extending a cool, firm hand. "I've reviewed the documents you sent, and I must confess, the audacity is remarkable. You are alleging that your sister, Olivia, committed identity theft and felony forgery to finalize your divorce in collusion with your estranged husband, Mr. Daniel Henderson. Is that correct?" "It is," I confirmed, pushing the entire packet of papers, the signed decree, the delivery envelope from Thorne and Associates, and a printout of the email detailing Daniel's attempted deflection across the immense glass conference table. Miss Sterling didn't touch the documents. She relied on the scan. "The marriage, legally speaking, is dissolved as of the filing date 3 weeks ago. We are operating under the assumption that this signature, despite its close resemblance, is not yours. It is Olivia's. She has a distinct microscopic loop on the capital C. My signature is flatter," I explained, the detail sounding impossibly small and pathetic in this vast room, yet it was the only piece of physical evidence I had until a forensic expert confirmed it. Miss Sterling nodded, pulling up the high-resolution scan on the monitor embedded in the table. "We will dispatch a forensic document examiner immediately. However, purely based on the timeline and the nature of the filing, a final decree delivered directly to your home by the husband's aggressive firm, the probability of fraud is extremely high." She paused, steepling her fingers. "We must now discuss objectives, Miss Henderson. Your situation is complex because your goals appear conflicted. You have been the victim of a criminal act, identity theft and forgery, which suggests criminal prosecution of your sister, Olivia. However, you've also been the victim of a fraudulent marital dissolution, which suggests nullification and renegotiation with Daniel." "Can I do both?" I asked, hating how breathless I sounded. "In theory, yes. In practice, they are often mutually exclusive, at least strategically," she countered. "If you pursue criminal charges against your sister, that path takes priority. It forces the state to investigate, leading to public discovery, police reports, potential arrest, and imprisonment. It is deeply satisfying, but it gives you almost no control over the outcome of the divorce settlement." She tapped the glass table. "The nullification path is the strategic one. If we can prove fraud definitively, we can petition the court to set aside or nullify the entire decree. The marriage, legally, will be resurrected." We then leveraged the threat of criminal charges against both Daniel and Olivia to force an immediate, equitable settlement designed on our terms, not theirs. It allows you to reclaim your financial future without relying on a slow, unpredictable criminal court process. Her words sliced through the emotional fog I had been carrying. Daniel's primary concern had been bad press and containment. He wanted me to accept a minor adjustment and quietly move on. Criminal prosecution of Olivia, while satisfying, would likely only scare Daniel into settling for slightly more than he'd initially offered. Nullification, however, would rip the entire fraudulent process to shreds, exposing his long-term scheme and potentially opening Thorne Associates to malpractice, forcing Daniel's hand entirely. Daniel tried to blame the entire thing on Olivia's madness and jealousy, I told Miss Sterling, my voice steady now. He admitted to talking to her about circumventing my lawyer, but claimed he never authorized the forgery. He wants me to believe she went rogue. Miss Sterling arched an eyebrow. A common defense. He created the perfect environment for her to commit a felony, knowing her personality, and now he claims shock. The forgery of the final papers is the key element of the crime, Miss Henderson, but the conspiracy to undermine the marriage process itself is the larger sin. If we can prove Daniel was actively colluding with Olivia in the weeks leading up to the final filing, his deflection collapses. I want the nullification, I stated. The decision solidified. It wasn't about revenge in a jail cell. It was about reclaiming the decade of my life they had stolen. I want the marriage legally resurrected only long enough for him to understand the cost of his betrayal. I want this divorce done fairly, and I want the legal record to reflect that this decree was absolute fraud. Miss Sterling smiled slightly, a cold, appreciative expression. Excellent. We will move to file the petition for nullification based on fraud immediately, while we await the forensic analysis. In the meantime, we need proof of continued recent communication between Daniel and your sister that contradicts his timeline. Did they use any shared communication methods? I shook my head. I don't know. Daniel is meticulous. He told me he talked to her months ago when she was concerned about my emotional state. But Olivia confessed they planned the exit strategy years ago. I need to know what they were planning between that initial arrangement and the final signing. The meeting concluded with a terrifyingly large retainer check, a sum I could barely afford but felt compelled to invest. I walked out of Sterling and Finch feeling marginally steadier, having traded overwhelming grief for focused legal clarity. I drove back to my sublet, the urgency of finding current communication burning inside me. Daniel had said they spoke months ago. If I could prove they spoke in the days or weeks immediately preceding the final filing, his entire defense structure that Olivia was a rogue agent would crumble. I knew Olivia's patterns. My sister was controlling, but she was also technologically lazy. She used the same 4 passwords for everything. Years ago, I had helped her set up the online portal for her personal bills, utilities, phone, insurance, a centralized hub she loved because it made her feel efficient. I pulled up the telecom carrier's login page. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the password I was fairly certain hadn't been changed since 2017. Her dog's name, followed by the year she moved into the house. Login successful. The access felt invasively intimate, like rifling through her private journal, but the urgency outweighed the guilt. I navigated to the usage records for her cell phone, filtering the output for the 3-week period immediately preceding the date on the final signed decree. The screen populated with hundreds of entries, friends, family, work contacts, and then there were the outliers. Scrolling down, I stopped on a sequence of outgoing calls and texts repeating over the course of 5 days, about 10 days before the final decree was sent. The number was unfamiliar, a string of digits that didn't correspond to Daniel's primary business line, his personal cell, or any number I recognized. But the pattern was suspicious. Short, discreet calls, never more than a minute, always between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. The carrier listed was a known anonymous prepaid service, exactly the kind of service Daniel used for the few sensitive business communications he didn't want recorded on his primary billing statement. He called them his ghost lines. My heart began to pound, a heavy, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I needed confirmation. I opened a separate browser window and searched the unfamiliar number. Nothing public. These lines were designed to be untraceable. But I knew Daniel. I had access to his business files during the marriage, and I remembered seeing his old expense reports for prepaid services, always billed to his LLC, never his personal account. I still had remote access to Daniel's old shared cloud drive for our joint investment portfolio, an access he must have forgotten to revoke when he changed his passwords during the initial separation. It was the digital equivalent of a broken window left open. I logged into the old drive. It took time, sifting through years of PDFs, but I found what I was looking for. A 2018 invoice to Daniel Shell Corporation for secure telecommunication services. Attached was a list of sequential burner numbers purchased and activated in bulk. I cross-referenced the numbers. My hands trembled as I typed. The number Olivia had been calling 10 days before the forgery was listed on that invoice, 3 numbers down from the ghost line Daniel had used to finalize the sale of his boat last summer. It was irrefutable. Daniel had activated that burner line. Olivia had called it repeatedly during the critical period when the final documents were being drafted, signed, and filed. Daniel had lied about the timeline of their communication. He hadn't just spoken to her months ago. He had been actively managing the final stage of the fraud with her just days before the papers landed on my doorstep. I sat back, absorbing the sickening reality. This wasn't a sudden, jealous overreach by my sister. This was a carefully coordinated, 2-person operation that concluded with a felony, and Daniel was directing it, using his expertise in evasion and his wife's sister's deep, poisonous jealousy as his instrument. I immediately captured screenshots of both the anonymous prepaid service invoice from Daniel's drive and the corresponding calls on Olivia's phone log, saving them as 2 separate, time-stamped files labeled the burner link. I drafted a brief email to Miss Sterling, attaching the evidence without fanfare. Proof of ongoing communication between D. Henderson and Olivia Henderson, directly contradicting his claim of 6 months of no contact prior to the filing. The discovery solidified my resolve. Daniel's deflection had been strategic. He wanted me to waste my energy hunting a ghost of betrayal past when the conspiracy was alive and well in the present. But his attempt to weaponize Olivia had left an obvious digital footprint I now held. The foundation of the marriage was gone, shattered by the confession. Now the foundation of Daniel's defense, that he was merely a victim of his sister-in-law's instability, was crumbling under the weight of a 30 prepaid phone service. I was no longer just the wronged wife, nor was I the panicked victim of identity theft. I was an investigator, armed with the best legal counsel money could buy, systematically dismantling a years-long scheme. The legal abyss was intimidating, but I was ready to dive in. The only question that remained was what exactly they had planned years ago. The forgery was the exit strategy. What was the entry plan? The wedding itself. I had to look back. I had to find the truth buried beneath the promises of that supposedly happy life. I had to find the source of the rot. The phone vibrated relentlessly against the polished granite countertop. Olivia. Always Olivia. The calls had started the moment the evidence of the burner line hit Miss Sterling's inbox, proof that my strategic silence had terrified her far more than my initial chaotic rage. She knew I had found something. She was used to controlling the narrative, used to my emotional outbursts that could be easily dismissed as hysteria. Now, she was calling every 10 minutes, desperate to lure me back into the ring where she could dissect my logic and deflect the blame. I let it ring, watching her name, Sister, flash on the screen until the automated voicemail picked up. I didn't need to hear her frantic, manufactured tears. Daniel had used her madness as a shield, but the digital trail proved they were merely 2 hands working the same dark puppet. The immediate crisis was contained, legally speaking. Now I needed to understand the structural rot Olivia had bragged about, the plan conceived years ago. The final forgery was the brutal ending, but I needed the prologue. My focus sharpened on the pre-wedding period. The engagement had been long and loud, a blur of catered parties, venue scouting, and endless consultations with Daniel's aggressive financial advisors, all under the guise of responsible partnership planning. Daniel was a successful investment strategist. His insistence on a watertight prenuptial agreement had been positioned as prudence, not malice. I had accepted it then as necessary protection for his premarital assets. But if Olivia had been involved then, the protection was aimed at someone else entirely, me. I needed a window into Olivia's life during that specific critical time, 4 years ago, when the first drafts of the prenup were circulated. Olivia had moved out of her old house 6 months ago, selling it quickly and moving into a sleek, smaller apartment. But before the closing, she had dumped all of her non-essential archival material, anything she considered too messy or nostalgic for her minimalist new life, into boxes and stored them in the unfinished basement of our parents' home. She considered that basement, with its climate control and locked wire storage cages, her personal vault. I knew the combination to the padlock on the cage. It was the date of her cat's adoption, a detail she'd told me years ago, presuming I'd never need it. My parents were on a golfing trip in Arizona, a rare 10-day absence. The house was empty. The silence felt illicit, heavy with years of unspoken resentment. I drove there, parking down the street, feeling like a thief in the neighborhood I grew up in. The basement was cool and dry, smelling faintly of concrete and mothballs. Olivia's cage was stacked high with banker's boxes labeled with her precise, controlling hand. Tax returns 2010, 2015, college transcripts, archival photos, and finally, the box I targeted, wedding planning 2019. I snapped the combination lock open, the tumblers falling with a soft final sound. The box inside was a tomb of forgotten joy. Thick white folders containing mock-ups of invitations, swatches of fabric for bridesmaid dresses, including the atrocious teal ones Olivia insisted on, and, scattered loosely at the bottom, engagement party guest lists and receipts for the florist. My gloves were already on. I rifled through the material, trying to filter out the noise of saccharine memory. I was looking for something official, something Daniel-related, something cold. Buried beneath a stack of glossy magazines detailing perfect bridal hair, I found an archaic, embossed leather document wallet. It wasn't the kind of thing Olivia would use now. It looked heavy and dated, likely a gift from Daniel's old-world associates. I opened the wallet. It was empty save for 2 items: a business card for a small, nondescript downtown bank branch, the Northwood Trust, and, tucked into the card slot, a small silver-toned key on a plain metal ring. Safety deposit box key, engraved with the number 409. My breath caught. Northwood Trust wasn't the bank my family used, nor was it Olivia's main financial institution. But it was just 2 blocks from the old high-rise Daniel had owned before we bought the large house we were currently separating in. It was a branch used by Daniel's office for confidential transactions that needed to be off-site. The cold certainty of the conspiracy settled further around me. This wasn't Olivia's key. This was a key to a shared secret vault. I checked the card details for the bank's operating hours. It was Friday, 1 p.m. I could make it before they closed. I put the key and the business card into my coat pocket. I needed no permission. My knowledge of Daniel's past financial habits was my authority. I returned the box and locked the cage, erasing my presence. 20 minutes later, I stood in the overly warm, silent, wood-paneled lobby of the Northwood Trust. I presented the key and my driver's license to the elderly attendant, feigning urgency and confusion. "Yes, key 409, the attendant said mildly, checking the records. "It's under the names of Henderson and, yes, Henderson and Evans." Evans was Olivia's maiden name. It was their box, jointly held, signed for years ago. "I'm here to access the documents," I said, projecting an air of familiarity and ownership. "My sister requested I pick up the originals." The attendant glanced at my last name, Henderson, matching the cosigner listed. He made a small confirming gesture. "Of course, Miss Henderson, please follow me." He led me through a heavy, grated door into the vault, a theatrical space of steel and security. He retrieved Box 409, a surprisingly small gray metal container, and escorted me to a small, private viewing booth separated by frosted glass panels. "Take your time," he instructed, before retreating, pulling the heavy, sound-dampening door closed behind him. I set the box on the counter. My fingers, steady despite the pulse hammering in my throat, lifted the lid. It wasn't filled with cash or diamonds. It was exactly what I had feared. Paper. There were 2 thick manila envelopes. One contained a neatly folded deed to a small, obscure piece of inherited property Daniel's family owned, something I had forgotten about entirely. The other contained copies of the initial, complex prenuptial drafts stamped Draft 1.1 and Draft 1.2 by Thorne and Associates. I pulled out the drafts. They weren't clean copies. They were heavy with annotations, written in 2 distinct inks, the vibrant, sharp red of Olivia's favorite pen and the thick, bold blue ink that Daniel only used when signing important documents. The air felt thin, suffocating. This was the blueprint of my marriage's destruction. I scanned the pages, focusing on the marginalia. Draft 1.1, 4 years prior, 3 months before the wedding. Red ink, Olivia. Beside the clause detailing the equitable division of marital assets upon dissolution, if filing occurs prior to 60 months, 5 years, redefine marital assets to exclude appreciation on premarital investments regardless of active management by Clara, loophole. Blue ink, Daniel. Circled the 60 Moss clause. Added in the margin, perfect, keeps portfolio clean. Thorne confirmed this holds up in state court. Draft 1.2, revised draft a month later. Red ink, Olivia. Beside the section detailing spousal support requirements, ensure Clara's emotional instability during separation is clearly documented by D. Revisit if this allows for the exclusion of spousal support, citing self-sabotage/fraud. Blue ink, Daniel. Underlining the word instability. Done. Will maintain records of erratic texts/calls if necessary. Need documentation of the inherent risk. They hadn't just planned the divorce, they had planned the failure. They designed the marriage to be financially expedient for Daniel if it ended quickly, and they specifically wrote in clauses that could be manipulated through the documentation of my perceived emotional weakness, a weakness Olivia had spent years cultivating and reporting back to Daniel, subtly and relentlessly. It was meticulous cruelty. Every argument, every insecure moment, every reliance on Olivia's false shoulder during the stress of the early marriage, it had all been gathered, weaponized, and drafted into an archaic covenant designed to fleece me. The betrayal wasn't just that they divorced me without my signature. The betrayal was that they had signed the contract on my life 4 years ago, and I was merely playing a part in their long-form drama. The wedding wasn't a commitment. It was the activation of a long-term financial strategy. I looked at the date stamp on Draft 1.1, October 12th. I remembered that day vividly. We had been finalizing the honeymoon plans. I had felt so much hope, so much naive belief in the future. Meanwhile, 2 blocks away, Daniel and my sister were charting the course of my financial destruction in red and blue ink. The sickening weight of this historical conspiracy crushed the last vestiges of my emotional resistance. I didn't feel rage. I felt a profound, cold emptiness. They hadn't just stolen a signature. They had stolen 4 years of my life and twisted it into a liability. I carefully, systematically photographed every single page of the annotated drafts, ensuring the red and blue ink markings were clear and legible against the parchment. I captured the date stamps, the bank card, and the key itself. This was the smoking gun. This was the absolute, unassailable evidence that Daniel had been planning this exit with Olivia since before we even walked down the aisle. and that the prenuptial agreement, which I had signed in good faith, was a deliberately rigged contract. I placed the documents back into box 409, closed the lid, and stepped out of the viewing booth. The elderly attendant returned the box to its slot in the vault. As I walked out of the Northwood Trust and back into the late afternoon sunlight, I didn't see the world in shades of grief anymore. I saw it in stark legal clarity. Daniel hadn't needed Olivia's business acumen to protect his assets because he was scared. He had needed her because she provided the perfect, emotionally manipulative conduit to both gather evidence against me and ensure the final fraudulent steps of the divorce were executed by someone he could plausibly throw under the bus. He had created a partnership, not a marriage. And my sister had been his most trusted business associate. I held the burner phone proof and these prenuptial blueprints. I now had the beginning and the end of their 4-year plot. The time for seeking justice had ended. The time for total war had begun. Miss Sterling would be pleased. The lobby of the Corinthian was hushed, smelling faintly of expensive jasmine and old money. Daniel had chosen it, predictably, a space where discretion was mandatory and emotional outbursts were managed swiftly by well-compensated staff. It was here, 7 years ago, that we had celebrated our engagement with an exclusive party, toasting to a future that I now knew was already being methodically undermined. I sat at a corner table, the copies of the annotated prenuptial drafts tucked neatly into an unmarked black folio beside my water glass. I didn't feel the adrenaline I'd felt when I confronted Olivia. This felt colder, more like a deposition than a confrontation. I was interviewing the chief architect of my own demise. Daniel arrived 5 minutes late, a calculating delay meant to project control. He wore a charcoal suit, still impeccably tailored, but his face was tightly drawn. He attempted a sympathetic expression, the kind he reserved for addressing market downturns or client disappointment, a sterile concern that never quite reached his eyes. "Clara, I appreciate you agreeing to meet privately," he murmured, sliding into the velvet banquette opposite me. He immediately scanned the lobby, confirming we weren't being watched. "Look, about the filing, I've told you, I didn't know Olivia went that far. I swear. It's indefensible, her desperation. We need to focus the legal strategy on her clear mental instability." He was already executing the plan they had written in red and blue ink 4 years ago, weaponize Olivia's instability to protect himself. I didn't dignify the lie with a response. I reached slowly for the folio, unzipping it with a quiet, deliberate rasp that seemed deafening in the silence of the high-ceilinged room. I extracted the copies, laying them flat on the dark wood table. I focused specifically on draft 1.2, turning it so the heavy, marked-up section regarding emotional instability faced him. The change in Daniel's posture was instantaneous. His shoulders tightened, the forced sympathy vaporized, replaced by a sudden, panicked realization that his meticulously constructed shield had been shattered. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low, sharp, devoid of any genuine curiosity. He knew exactly what it was. "This, Daniel," I said, my voice steady, "is the marriage contract you drew up with my sister 4 years before we celebrated here. The one you told me was necessary to protect your premarital assets." I tapped the red ink notation beside the asset division clause. "This is where she advised you to redefine marital assets if the divorce occurred before 60 months. We separated at 48 months. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" He didn't look at the document. He looked only at my face, assessing the damage. "It's an initial draft, Clara. Lawyers do due diligence. We negotiated those clauses extensively before the final signing." "But you negotiated them with Olivia, not me," I corrected, leaning forward. "These aren't legal recommendations. They are internal notes, Daniel. Your blue ink confirms you agreed with the strategy. Perfect. Keeps portfolio clean. This wasn't about due diligence, darling. This was about designing a cynical covenant of marriage that ensured a quick, financially favorable exit for you should I prove too expensive or too inconvenient to keep around past the 5-year mark. I moved to the section about documenting my perceived mental state. And this is where the real beauty lies. You and Olivia plotting how to document my emotional volatility so you could potentially eliminate spousal support. Did you know she was feeding you transcripts of our private conversations? Did you know every time she consoled me after one of our fights, she was logging it as evidence for Thorne and Associates? The accusation hung in the air, heavy and absolute. He inhaled sharply, pushing a hand through his carefully styled hair, a rare, genuine sign of distress. Stop it, Clara, he finally hissed. You don't understand the pressures I was under. This is highly confidential planning documentation. You shouldn't have access to this. But I do. And now I need you to explain the partnership. Why, Olivia? Why did the meticulous, controlling Olivia, who supposedly despised you and my choice of husband, dedicate 4 years to ensuring your financial security? He looked utterly defeated, the facade of the wronged husband finally cracking to reveal the terrified boy beneath the power suit. I needed her, Clara. I needed her strategic input, he confessed, the words tasting like ash. Thorne was aggressive, yes, but he only saw the legal side. Olivia understood you. She understood the family dynamic, the emotional vulnerabilities. She was a necessary evil. A necessary evil who happened to hate me, I countered flatly. He avoided my eyes. I admitted, I made a pact with her. When the first draft of the prenup came back, it was too soft on your side, too risky for my early investments. I was terrified, Clara. Terrified that if things went sour, your emotional state, your volatility would drain everything I had built. I needed someone who could ensure the structural integrity of the prenup from the inside, someone who could confirm that the narrative of your instability would hold up in court if required. So you didn't marry me, Daniel. You married a financial strategy, and Olivia was the co-CEO. He flinched. That's unfair. I loved you, or I thought I did, but love doesn't protect billions of dollars from a contentious separation. Olivia offered a clean exit strategy. She approached me after the initial draft was sent out, claiming she saw loopholes. She said she could optimize the language and provide documentation. I took the deal. He was confessing to the entire prenuptial conspiracy, the cold, calculating outsourcing of his marital cruelty, but still clung to the notion that he was the financially prudent victim. And what was the price of Olivia's optimization, Daniel? I pressed, leaning in closer. Olivia is highly transactional. She doesn't operate on charity, especially not for the man who was marrying her younger, lesser sister. What did she demand for 4 years of calculated evidence gathering and strategic advice? Daniel suddenly looked miserable, caught between loyalty to his co-conspirator and the looming threat of legal exposure. He glanced down at the documents, his fingers drumming nervously on the tabletop. It wasn't money, he admitted, his voice barely a rasp. That's what you won't understand about your sister. She doesn't need cash. She needs control. She wanted something only I could guarantee. Tell me. He hesitated, rubbing his temples. She wanted public affirmation. She felt invisible, Clara, always in your shadow, always overshadowed by what she called your effortless good fortune. She didn't want my capital. She wanted something specific related to the family, something that proved conclusively that she was the stable, trusted daughter. He finally looked up, his eyes laced with a mixture of shame and genuine bewilderment at the depth of Olivia's demands. She demanded that when the separation was finalized, cleanly, quietly, just as we planned it, I would ensure you were cut off from the small estate interest your grandfather left both of you. But more than that, he lowered his voice until it was nearly inaudible. She insisted that I use my influence with your parents to publicly endorse her as the only emotionally and financially stable sibling fit to inherit the main family holdings. She wanted me to confirm to your mother and father explicitly that you were too erratic, too volatile to be trusted. A cold void opened up in my stomach, swallowing all the residual warmth of the memory of my family. It wasn't about money for Olivia. It was about status, inheritance, and the utter, brutal destruction of my standing within the family unit. Daniel hadn't just paid her with my marriage, he had paid her with my entire identity. The plan wasn't just to divorce me, it was to isolate and eliminate me, leaving Olivia standing alone on the pedestal she desperately coveted. I leaned back, the initial shock giving way to a sickening clarity. Daniel was a corporate predator, but Olivia was the true emotional assassin. He was a coward who had happily outsourced his greed and cruelty to the one person capable of delivering the final, crushing familial blow. "You are despicable, Daniel," I stated, not as an insult, but as a diagnosis. I gathered the evidence copies and slid them back into the folio. "You didn't protect yourself. You facilitated the destruction of my life using my own sister as your weapon, simply because you were too weak to face a fair negotiation." He began to argue, citing the need for containment, pleading with me to use this information only against Olivia, but I was already rising. "Save your breath for Mr. Thorne, Daniel. You won't be able to deflect this one onto Olivia's madness alone. You laid the foundation for the fraud 4 years ago, and I have the blueprints. I know what you asked for, and I know the devastating price she demanded. You are both equally culpable." I left him sitting there, frozen amidst the quiet luxury of the Corinthian lobby, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking too big for the small, frightened man inside it. The crushing truth wasn't just that my marriage had been a lie. It was that my entire family dynamic had been weaponized for years, and Daniel, my supposed partner, had simply been the highest bidder in Olivia's relentless campaign to erase me. The next confrontation wouldn't be about proof of forgery or financial documents. It would be about years of malignant envy and the terrifying, real-world cost of sibling rivalry. And this time, I was going directly to the source of the poison. Olivia would have to finally, truly, answer for the price of her hatred. The scent of bleach and sterile perfection hit Clara the moment Olivia opened the door to her high-rise condo. It was a perfect reflection of her sister, immaculate, controlled, and utterly devoid of warmth. Olivia was dressed in tailored slacks and a silk blouse, looking as if she had just stepped out of a high-stakes board meeting. Her expression was one of glacial annoyance, a look she perfected whenever Clara intruded upon her carefully curated routine. "I called the building manager, Clara. If you refuse to leave, I will have you removed. This harassment is precisely why Daniel and I—" "Daniel told me the price," Clara interrupted, stepping across the threshold before Olivia could slam the door shut. She didn't raise her voice. The control in her tone was more effective than any shout. "He told me exactly what you demanded in exchange for orchestrating my financial demise." Olivia froze, the practiced mask of indignation faltering. For a split second, a raw, naked panic flashed in her eyes, the realization that Daniel, their partner in conspiracy, had cracked under pressure and revealed the ultimate vulnerability, the motive that was far more personal than cash. "I don't know what lies he is feeding you now," Olivia said, regaining her posture, her voice tight and low. Daniel is a master deflector. He's terrified of facing the consequences of the divorce being nullified, so he's trying to drag everyone down with him. Clara walked past her, deliberately dropping her coat onto Olivia's pristine cream sofa, violating the sacred order of the room. She turned, meeting her sister's eyes squarely. "He told me about the estate interest, Olivia, grandfather's legacy. He told me you insisted on ensuring I was cut off, guaranteeing it fell solely to you. But that wasn't the real currency, was it? That was just collateral damage." Clara took a step forward, watching the blood drain slowly from Olivia's face. "He told me you demanded he use his influence with Mom and Dad," Clara continued, her voice like grinding ice. "He told me you insisted he publicly, to the family, to his closest circle, endorse you as the only stable, financially responsible, emotionally fit heir. He told me you needed him to confirm, explicitly, that I was too erratic and volatile to ever be trusted with the family legacy. You didn't want his money, Olivia. You wanted my erasure." The air in the apartment became thick and suffocating. Olivia didn't deny it. She couldn't. The specificity of the demand, the emotional brutality, the surgical focus on Clara's standing within the family was undeniable proof. Olivia straightened, her chin lifting defiantly. The fear receded, replaced by a cold, searing resentment that had clearly been decades in the making. "And what if I did?" she challenged, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "It's the truth, isn't it? You are volatile, Clara. You always have been. You live purely on emotion, bouncing from crisis to crisis, expecting everyone else to mop up your mess." "This wasn't about financial prudence," Clara retorted, her chest aching with the years of misdirected loyalty. "This was about vengeance. This was about destroying me so thoroughly that you could finally stand in the spotlight you've always coveted." Olivia laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed off the minimalist walls. "Spotlight? You think I care about a spotlight, Clara? I care about visibility. I care about recognition." She paced once, stopping directly in front of Clara, her eyes blazing with furious, manic energy. "Did you ever once stop and think, growing up, how easy it was for you? You existed, and suddenly you were adored. The preferred child, the prettiest, the most artistic, the one Mom dressed up in silly little bows and paraded around. Everything was effortless for you." Clara felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. This wasn't the petty jealousy over a boyfriend or a dress. This was the acid of a lifetime of feeling unseen by the people who mattered most. "I spent every waking hour studying," Olivia hissed, gesturing emphatically with a manicured hand. "I sacrificed sleep, parties, friends, everything to achieve the impeccable grades, the flawless financial discipline, the perfect reputation. I was the one Mom and Dad relied on for the taxes. I was the one who managed the estate planning when grandfather was sick. I was the responsible one. And yet, who did they always look at first?" She jabbed a finger toward Clara. "You, always you. Oh, Clara got a C on her paper, but she's so creative. Olivia got straight A's, but she needs to lighten up a bit, doesn't she? They tolerated my success. They celebrated your failures because your failures required emotional engagement. So you decided to eliminate the competition," Clara stated, her voice heavy with the crushing weight of realization. "You spent 4 years collaborating with my husband, my enemy, to create a documented narrative that would prove to our parents that I was the disposable liability. You wanted to make sure that when I finally hit rock bottom, there was no safety net and no family left to mourn my fall." Olivia stared back, the toxic sibling dynamic laid bare and horrifying. I made a strategic investment, she corrected, her voice chillingly clinical. I invested in ensuring that the decades of my hard work and responsible management would finally be recognized and rewarded appropriately. You had to be removed, Clara. You were the anomaly, the emotional wild card that threatened the structural integrity of the entire family system. And the forgery, Clara pressed, was that a strategic investment too? Forging my signature on a legal decree? Olivia waved a dismissive hand. A procedural necessity. Daniel was dragging his feet on the final settlement because of the revised asset schedules. He was scared of Thorne finding out about the initial prenup drafts. I simply expedited the closing argument. It was a minor ethical transgression to protect a malignant strategy. No, Clara whispered, shaking her head. It was the act of a destroyer. You didn't just want Daniel's endorsement. You wanted to dismantle my life entirely. You wanted me isolated, discredited, and erased, so that when the inheritance finally settled, there would be no question of who deserved the trust. You wanted to win our childhood, years too late. The accusation hit its mark. Olivia's eyes narrowed, glittering with triumphant spite. I won, Clara. You are legally divorced, financially exposed, and you have exposed yourself as a woman so unstable you show up screaming in front of my home, threatening me over a signed document. Daniel's exit strategy worked perfectly, thanks to my input. You have nothing left now but the documents proving you were too volatile to trust. And the best part? Your parents will see this behavior, this desperation, and they will confirm everything Daniel and I laid out in those beautiful, optimized drafts. The cruel calculation, the utter lack of human warmth, settled around Clara like a shroud. Daniel was weak and greedy, but Olivia was fundamentally malignant. Her motives ran deeper than any financial transaction. They were steeped in psychological warfare dating back to the elementary school playground. You traded me, Clara said softly, the statement of final verdict. You traded your sister's marriage, her future, and her standing in the family for the opportunity to finally be visible to our parents. I secured my future, Olivia countered flatly. And frankly, Clara, I did you a favor. You always needed drama to feel alive. Now you have it. Go run to your lawyer and try to nullify a divorce filed by your sister. It will only make you look more unstable. Clara stared at the woman who was supposed to be her blood, her confidant, the person who was supposed to stand by her, only to discover she had been the operative behind the entire assassination plot. The revelation that Daniel was merely a tool in her sister's hands, a means to achieve familial superiority, was the most devastating truth of all. She walked deliberately to the couch, retrieved her coat, and zipped the folio containing the damning blueprints of their conspiracy. This isn't over, Olivia, Clara said, standing tall at the entryway. You gambled on my destruction, banking on the fact that Daniel would protect you and that I would crumble under the weight of the lie. You never anticipated I would fight back, armed with the precise knowledge of your years of calculated hatred. You have no proof I forged anything, Olivia said, a hint of steel returning to her voice. You have only the word of your discredited, cowardly ex-husband who is trying to save his billions. And you have your own increasingly manic behavior. I have the evidence of the conspiracy, Clara corrected. I have the motive, the method, and the written proof that the divorce was engineered for the sole purpose of elevating your position at the expense of mine. Daniel paid you in psychological currency, Olivia, and now I will ensure he pays for the fraud, and you pay for the price you demanded. Clara stepped back into the hallway, leaving the immaculate silence of Olivia's apartment behind. The realization was complete, crushing, and utterly liberating. Her sister hadn't just committed a crime. She had waged a war of annihilation against her own kin, driven by a desperate, toxic need to be seen. The time for private confrontation was over. The only path left led straight to her parents' door. They had been blind for decades. Now they would be forced to look directly at the poison they had fostered. The Henderson house was built for permanence, a heavy brick structure nestled behind ancient oaks, smelling faintly of lemon polish and the perpetual, comforting aroma of Mom's favorite Earl Grey tea. It was the sanctuary of Clara's childhood, the place she instinctively ran to when the world outside grew too sharp. Now, as she walked up the stone pathway, the scent of home felt less like comfort and more like a decaying illusion. Clara carried the slim leather folio under her arm, a terrible, elegant container of catastrophe. Her parents were waiting in the sunroom, the space where all difficult conversations were traditionally staged, always softened by natural light and the distant sound of wind chimes. Mom, ever watchful, sat knitting a complicated wool pattern. Her needles stilled the moment Clara entered. Dad stood by the window, his shoulders tense, looking out at the manicured garden, perhaps searching for an escape route. "Clara," Mom started, her voice laced with the anxious tremor that always preceded an attempt at mediation. "Olivia called. She was very upset. She said you threatened her and that you made wild accusations about Daniel." "I did," Clara confirmed, pulling out a chair at the glass-topped table without being invited. She laid the folio down. The sound of leather hitting glass was disproportionately loud in the quiet room. "And I came here to present the evidence backing those accusations. This isn't a conversation about feelings, Mom. This is about legal fraud, orchestrated psychological warfare, and years of calculated betrayal by your eldest daughter." Clara opened the folio, deliberately and slowly. She didn't lead with emotion. She led with fact, knowing that her parents, particularly her father, valued structural integrity above all else. She first presented the certified document from the forensic handwriting analyst, the unambiguous conclusion that the signature on her divorce decree was a forgery, executed by someone with prolonged access to her legal documents, confirming the procedural necessity Olivia had so casually dismissed. Dad finally turned from the window, his face pale and drawn. He was a man who understood contracts and integrity. The word forgery landed like a physical blow. "This is insane," he muttered, reaching for the document, his hand shaking slightly. "This can't be right. Olivia would never risk prison over a divorce settlement. It's too reckless." "It wasn't about the settlement amount," Clara said calmly, sliding the second set of documents across the table. "That was just the stage dressing. This was about eliminating competition for your favor. Look at these." These were the annotated prenuptial drafts pulled from Olivia's safety deposit box, marked up in Daniel's tight, controlled script and Olivia's precise, angular handwriting. Clara pointed specifically to the sections detailing the asset protection strategies that only benefited Daniel upon swift dissolution, and the clear, cold notes about leveraging Clara's emotional instability to ensure favorable negotiation terms. "This wasn't a prenup, Dad. This was an exit plan designed years ago, perfected by Daniel's lawyers and optimized by Olivia." The fraud wasn't just signing the paper. The fraud was the entire marriage. Mom dropped her knitting. The needles clattered onto the tile floor. "Why, Clara? Why would they do this? Daniel, maybe. He's always been opportunistic. But Olivia, she has everything. Why would she involve herself in such a vicious plot?" Clara looked into her mother's eyes, seeing not understanding, but a desperate protective ignorance. Because what she has, the impeccable career, the perfect condo, the financial stability, was never enough to secure what she really needed, your absolute, unwavering recognition. Clara then recounted the specific demands Olivia made to Daniel, the insistence on being publicly endorsed as the only stable sibling, the requirement that Clara be cut off from the family estate investment. She told me, Mom, to my face. She said she was tired of being the responsible one whose successes were tolerated while my emotional failures were celebrated. She saw me as the emotional wild card, threatening the structural integrity of the family system. She engineered my destruction to finally be visible to you both. A heavy, agonizing silence fell. Mom's hand went to her mouth, not in surprise, but in a familiar gesture of avoidance. Dad, after reviewing the documents, pushed them back toward Clara as if they were physically contaminated. Clara, this is awful, Dad conceded, his voice gravely low. But you know your sister. She's intense. She gets tunnel vision. She probably saw this as a complicated business transaction that got messy. She was trying to protect Daniel's assets, maybe, and got carried away. She has a terrible need for control. Clara felt a sickening wave of déjà vu. The words, intense, messy, need for control, were the same veiled excuses they had used to explain away every cruel, manipulative act Olivia had committed since childhood. No, Clara insisted, fighting the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her hard-won composure. You are not listening. She conspired with my husband for 4 years. She forged my name to nullify my rights. This wasn't a messy transaction, Dad. This was an assassination. Mom leaned forward, her eyes pleading. But she is still our daughter, Clara. She is still your sister. Whatever she did, we have to handle this as a family. We cannot air this sort of dirty laundry. If you go after her legally, if you pursue criminal charges, what will that do to the family name? What about the scandal? The shift was instant and devastating. They were not defending Clara's rights. They were defending the illusion of the Henderson family unit. They were afraid of the truth shattering the fragile peace they maintained. You want me to protect her, Clara realized, the heat rising in her chest. You want me to minimize the fact that she collaborated in the systematic destruction of my marriage and my finances just to avoid scandal. Dad stepped closer, trying to soften the blow with proximity. We need to find a way forward for all of us. She made a terrible mistake. We will talk to her, of course. We will make sure she understands the gravity of what she did. But you must not go to the authorities, Clara. We cannot risk seeing her face jail time or being disbarred. We need to handle this quietly. Quietly? Clara's voice cracked, but she forced the emotion back, replacing it with cold, hard resolve. She committed a felony to erase me, and you want to manage her reputation? For decades, you enabled this vicious need for superiority, by always smoothing over her intensity, by always giving her the benefit of the doubt over my feelings. And now, faced with undeniable proof of her malignancy, you are choosing to prioritize her protection and the comfort of the family myth? Clara gathered the documents, stacking them neatly in the folio. She didn't need their comfort, she needed their witness. They had failed the test. You cannot stand on both sides of a crime, Clara stated, standing up, forcing them both to look up at her. I am going to nullify this fraudulent divorce. I am going to pursue legal justice for the conspiracy, and I will use the threat of criminal prosecution against Olivia to ensure Daniel pays for the fraud he committed alongside her. She met her mother's tearful gaze, then her father's rigid refusal to meet her eyes. I need to know unequivocally where you stand. Do you support me, your daughter, who has been victimized by a 4-year plot, or do you choose to protect the stability and reputation of the aggressor? Mom's face crumpled. Clara, please, don't make us choose between our children. We love you both. That answer is the choice, Clara said, the finality settling over her like a heavy shroud. The realization that they would always choose the comfort of the status quo, the familiar dynamic where Olivia was allowed to wield her control so long as the family name remained spotless, was the final, crushing truth. I thought to bring you the facts, hoping that seeing the depth of her calculation would finally open your eyes. But you refuse to see anything that threatens the perfect picture you've painted. She zipped the folio shut. The gentle sound of the wind chimes outside felt suddenly mocking. I cannot and will not continue to be a part of a family that prioritizes maintaining a peaceful illusion over protecting its own from verifiable, documented abuse, Clara declared, her voice steady and ringing with the painful clarity of absolute isolation. Clara, where are you going? Dad demanded, taking a heavy step toward her. I am going to pursue justice, she answered simply, and since you have made it clear that my pursuit of safety and truth is a threat to your stability, consider this my final break. I will no longer participate in this toxic dynamic. I will no longer allow the fear of Olivia's intensity to dictate my life, and I will certainly not allow it to dictate yours. She walked toward the doorway. Mom scrambled after her, grabbing her arm. Clara, you can't mean that. We're your family. We'll find a way to fix this, without lawyers. Clara gently removed her mother's hand. The gesture was tender but firm, a boundary drawn in painful, irreversible stone. You can't fix malignancy, Mom. You can only cut it out, Clara whispered, the deep sorrow of the lost relationship heavier than the fear of the legal battle ahead. And sometimes, the hardest truth is realizing that the people who were supposed to be your foundation are the ones who handed the tools to your executioner. I am alone in this fight now, and I am finally okay with that. She left the sunroom, leaving her parents stranded amidst the lemon polish and the silenced wind chimes. She didn't look back as she walked out of the house. The familiar, comforting brick structure now felt cold and brittle, a monument to a life and a family that had never truly existed outside the limits of a desperately maintained lie. The confrontation hadn't resulted in justice or understanding, but in something far more profound, a complete, devastating severance. Clara was now truly free of the expectation of their loyalty, and in that isolation, she found a singular, frightening strength. The last vestiges of her previous life were severed, leaving her unburdened by the need for familiar approval and ready to face the full force of the legal system. The sun, filtered through the severe vertical blinds of Mr. Davies' downtown office, cut the room into sharp, cold stripes of light and shadow. The atmosphere was no longer one of sympathetic legal advice, but of specialized warfare. Mr. Davies, usually a man of jovial, disarming manners, had shed his gentle exterior. His voice, when he spoke, was low and tightly controlled. We are no longer pursuing divorce, Clara. We are pursuing fraud, he stated, adjusting his glasses. This is a different animal entirely. The risk profile shifts. If we file criminal charges against your sister, that opens the case to public scrutiny, a scandal that will involve two prominent families and potentially the disbarment of several attorneys involved in processing the fraudulent documents. Clara leaned forward, her hands flat on the polished mahogany table. She wore a tailored suit, not for fashion, but for the psychological armor it provided. She felt every minute of the past week dragging on her bones, but her resolve was absolute. That is precisely the point, Mr. Davies, she replied, her voice steady. Daniel does not care about Olivia's future or her loyalty. He cares about his reputation and his pocketbook. A public fraud case involving a conspiracy between him and his wife's sister, dating back years, will obliterate his standing faster than any custody battle or financial negotiation. We are using Olivia's criminal recklessness as the weapon, but we are pointing it squarely at Daniel's fear. Mr. Davies nodded slowly, acknowledging the surgical precision of her logic. He understood that Clara was no longer seeking emotional redress. She was seeking strategic superiority. The first step, then, is the nullification filing, he confirmed, tapping a thick stack of papers. We petition the court to void the existing decree ab initio, as if it never happened, on the grounds of criminal procedural fraud. That immediately puts Daniel and Mr. Thorne on notice that we aren't playing the standard game anymore. The paperwork was filed that afternoon. The immediate legal effect was a cessation of the terms of the fraudulent decree. Assets were temporarily frozen, and legally, Clara and Daniel were once again recognized as still married. The entire complex edifice of their divorce dissolved with a few carefully chosen legal words. The response from Mr. Thorne's office was immediate and aggressive, but laced with a new frantic edge. Thorne demanded a meeting to discuss the malicious and defamatory filing. "They are scared," Clara observed simply, reviewing the heated correspondence in Davies' office the next day. "Thorne is still bluffing with legal jargon, but the heat is coming off Daniel. He's trying to contain the detonation." Mr. Davies prepared the counteroffer, which was less an offer and more an ultimatum. The terms were brutal. Clara would receive an equitable division of assets calculated from the date of the wedding, disregarding the terms of the fraudulent decree. Daniel would cover all of Clara's legal fees incurred since the initial divorce filing. Crucially, the settlement required Daniel to sign a sworn affidavit admitting to his knowledge of Olivia's involvement in the asset strategy, though not the forgery itself, and agreeing to the nullification of the decree without appeal. If he refused, Davies was instructed to proceed with filing criminal conspiracy charges against Olivia, directly implicating Daniel as a co-conspirator through the documented communications and the annotated prenuptial pact. The hours that followed were a silent, grueling test of wills. Clara waited in a small, windowless conference room, refusing to leave the office, drinking lukewarm coffee and watching the digital clock tick. She wasn't worried about the financial outcome anymore. She was focused entirely on achieving the strategic victory, the acknowledgement of the lie. Finally, after 7 agonizing hours, Mr. Davies returned, his face etched with exhaustion, but a faint triumph in his eyes. "Thorne cracked," he announced, dropping into the chair opposite her. "Daniel fought the affidavit tooth and nail, claiming it's a form of coercion. We stood firm. We gave him 30 minutes to choose between a financially painful but private resolution or the immediate filing of criminal fraud charges that would undoubtedly lead to a grand jury investigation into his business practices." "And his choice?" Clara prompted, her heart beating a heavy rhythm against her ribs. "He chose silence," Davies said, pushing a thick document across the table. "He signed. He capitulated. He wants this entire matter buried so deep the ground will never recover." Clara picked up the new settlement agreement. It was clean, concise, and finally fair. It returned control over the family estate investment to her, something Daniel and Olivia had conspired to steal. It provided the financial security she had been denied by the fraudulent papers. But the most satisfying element was not the money. It was the psychological victory embedded in the affidavit. Daniel Henderson, the man who had orchestrated the lie of their marriage and then engineered her downfall, was admitting, on record, to the toxic pact with her sister. He was giving her the truth, not through remorse, but through legal force. "And Olivia?" Clara asked, looking up from the documents. The moment Daniel signed that affidavit and the new settlement, the leverage disappears. "We hold the documents. We hold the proof of fraud, but we no longer need the criminal charges to achieve justice for you. The nullification is guaranteed, and the settlement is equitable. We contain the malignancy before it spreads, ensuring your financial stability without triggering the public trial that would ruin your own family name, however much they may deserve it. It was pragmatism over vengeance, and though part of Clara wanted the satisfaction of watching Olivia face public ruin, the cold logic of her lawyer prevailed. She had secured what she needed most: control over her future and the legal admission of the betrayal. Clara spent the next hour reviewing the new agreement with meticulous focus, initialing every page, ensuring the language was airtight. When she finally reached the signature line, the pen felt heavier than any weapon. She was signing the real divorce papers, the ones born of strategy and necessity, not forgery and manipulation. As she signed her name, Clara Henderson, one final time before the ink dried, the weight of the last 4 years seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a terrible emptiness. "It's done," she said quietly, handing the packet back to Davies. "Justice is served, Clara. Legally speaking, you have achieved a phenomenal victory," Davies said, offering a genuine relieved smile. "You not only got a favorable settlement, but you forced a multi-party conspiracy to unravel under the threat of public exposure. Most people would have just filed for divorce and walked away damaged. You fought back and reclaimed your life's narrative." Clara didn't return the smile. She knew the papers, the signatures, the legal maneuvering. These were just the scaffolding. The real battle had been internal, and the victory was merely survival. She had won the fight against Daniel and Olivia, but she had lost her family, her sanctuary, and the foundational trust that allows a person to stand securely in the world. She had secured her financial freedom, but she was now absolutely, truly alone. She stood up, feeling the strange, unsettling calm that follows a major seismic event. "Thank you, Mr. Davies," she murmured. "What is the next step?" "Now," he replied, looking at her with a depth of concern that went beyond professional duty, "now you start building a new life. This chapter is closed, nullified." Clara left the legal office and stepped out onto the busy street, the sound of traffic loud in her ears. She was financially stable, legally free, and possessed of a grim, undeniable truth about the malignant nature of the two people who had claimed to love her most. She had fought the fire and extinguished it, but the surrounding landscape was ash. She pulled out her phone. She needed to call the movers. She needed to find a therapist. She needed to erase Clara Henderson, the woman who had trusted and been betrayed, and invent someone entirely new. The reclamation had begun, not with triumph, but with the painful, necessary act of disconnection. The next phase was not about justice. It was about healing the wound that her family had inflicted. The house was unnaturally quiet. The noise of the legal fight, the demanding phone calls, the furious typing, the constant low hum of adrenaline had ceased, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. Clara walked through the emptied rooms, the polished hardwood reflecting the weak, late-afternoon sun. The settlement was finalized, the nullification confirmed, and the money was secured. Yet the victory tasted like ash in her mouth. She realized she was not experiencing joy or even relief, but a deep, overwhelming fatigue. The fight had calcified the betrayal into a permanent internal landscape. Now that the external pressure was gone, the somatic weight of the last 4 years settled in her joints and behind her eyes. Her first act of recovery was signing up for intensive therapy. She didn't look for a local referral. She found a renowned specialist 2 hours away, needing the distance and the clinical detachment of a stranger. Dr. Rossi was sharp, empathetic, and utterly unwilling to let Clara hide behind her legal triumph. "You won the war, Clara," Dr. Rossi said during their third session, her voice calm as she steepled her fingers. but you are still grieving the version of yourself who didn't know the truth. That woman was annihilated by the realization that her life was an intricately planned theater co-directed by her sister and her husband. Clara nodded, staring at a print on the wall. She hated that term, annihilated, but it was true. She had come to understand that her constant feeling of invisibility during her marriage had not been a flaw in perception, but a feature of the conspiracy. Daniel needed her small and easily dismissed. Olivia needed her small and easily manipulated. Therapy became the forensic examination of memory. They sifted through childhood interactions, identifying the microaggressions and conditional love that had primed Clara to accept Olivia's control. They dissected the way she had internalized the family narrative that Olivia was the stable, successful one, creating a need in Clara to prove her worth through loyalty, even when that loyalty became self-destructive. You kept running back to the fire, believing that if you were loyal enough or quiet enough or successful enough, they would finally see you, Dr. Rossi observed gently. You confused self-betrayal with commitment. That realization was a gut punch. Clara had always prided herself on her devotion to family. Now she saw that devotion not as virtue, but a misplaced, toxic vulnerability. She had tolerated the unacceptable, not because she was weak, but because she valued the idea of family connection over the reality of self-preservation. The next necessary step was physical separation. She put the marital house on the market, pricing it to sell quickly. She had her financial freedom. She didn't need to squeeze every last penny out of the tainted property. She hired a service to pack and ship only the bare necessities, books, clothes, a few pieces of art that held no residual memory of Daniel or Olivia. Everything else she donated or discarded. The entire structure of her old life was dismantled in 3 efficient weeks. The most defining moment of this period came in the courtroom, not for litigation, but for administration. She filed the paperwork to legally drop Henderson. When the clerk asked if she wished to revert to her maiden name, Clara paused. Her maiden name, Miller, still carried the association of the parents who had minimized her pain and prioritized Olivia's convenience. She had to erase the entirety of that past. No, Clara stated clearly. I am returning to my birth name, but not my maiden name. My name is Clara Maeve. She chose a name that had belonged only to her, untainted by Daniel's legal ownership or her family's judgment. The new identification card, bearing the clean, unfamiliar script of Clara Maeve, felt like an exorcism. She was now a stranger to her old identity, an unwritten page. During this time, the attempts at contact from her family were sporadic, usually channeled through desperate, emotionally laden voice messages left by her mother. Clara, your father and I just don't understand this refusal to speak. We know what Olivia did was terrible, but she is your sister. We have to forgive, darling. We need the family to heal. Where are you? Please just call your mother. Clara listened to the messages once, then deleted them without replying. The guilt was a dull, residual ache, but it no longer compelled her. She had given them the truth. She had shown them the evidence of their favored child's malice. Their choice to prioritize their own comfort and the myth of familial harmony over the devastating reality of their daughter's betrayal was the final, irreversible nail in the coffin. She was done trying to convince them to choose her. She had chosen herself. She finalized the purchase of a small loft apartment in a city 3 states away, a place where she knew no one and where the culture was refreshingly anonymous. She didn't tell Mr. Davies exactly where she was going, merely that she would be unreachable for a time. He understood. On the morning of the move, she took one final walk through the empty house. The silence was perfect. There was no ghost of Daniel in the study, no lingering residue of Olivia's controlling presence in the kitchen. She wasn't fleeing, she was simply vacating a premises that had fulfilled its duty. She got into her car, a vehicle she had purchased new for the move, leaving the old life behind, including the memories associated with every road and familiar landscape. As she drove east, crossing the state line, she experienced an intense physical sensation of lightness. The constant, tense scrutiny she had lived under for years had evaporated. In the first week in the new apartment, Clara did very little. She didn't unpack immediately. She slept for long, uninterrupted stretches, allowing the exhaustion she had fiercely suppressed during the legal battle to finally claim her. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the few boxes she had kept, looking out the large window at the foreign cityscape. She was physically isolated, legally untethered, and entirely alone. The profound loneliness was a stark, cold fact, yet it wasn't terrifying. It was clean. This space, this absolute void left by the excision of Daniel, Olivia, and the extended web of family obligation, was the first place she felt safe. There was no one to please, no lie to maintain, no expectation to fulfill. The slow, painstaking work of recovery had begun, not with a bang or a triumphant speech, but with the quiet realization that she was finally, mercifully, free to be ordinary, invisible, and unburdened. She was learning that self-discovery was less about finding spectacular new traits and more about shedding the painful layers of loyalty she had carried for people who had only ever sought to destroy her. The calendar on the minimalist desk displayed the date, a full 12 months since Clara had driven east, abandoning the tainted geography of her former life. The loft apartment, high above the new city, was bathed in the cool, crisp light of a Saturday morning. The space felt curated, not decorated. Every object served a purpose, and nothing held the shadow of regret. Clara Maeve, now legally and emotionally untethered, moved with an ease that had been foreign to her for decades. The exhaustion of the legal battle and the subsequent months of intensive therapy had finally given way to a lean, resilient energy. She was making coffee, slow, meticulous pour-over, the aroma filling the air, a small, satisfying ritual of self-care. She often reflected on the sheer, crushing weight of the truth. It was a paradox. The truth that her entire marriage was a performance, that her sister had been actively malicious for years, that her parents had prioritized a fragile, convenient fiction over her genuine suffering, should have destroyed her entirely. Instead, it was the only thing that had saved her. The illusion, the subtle, systemic lie of her belonging, had kept her small and tethered to the toxic dynamic. The forgery, the brazen, undeniable evidence of Olivia's deep hatred and Daniel's calculated complicity had been the bomb blast that leveled the false edifice of her life. She remembered Dr. Rossi's clinical, crucial insight. You can't fix a marriage built on a lie, and you can't heal a family relationship built on spite. You have to walk away and let the rot consume itself. She had walked away. The void that had initially felt like cold loneliness had gradually transformed into the most precious commodity she possessed, unadulterated solitude. There was no longer any need to filter her words, manage her reactions, or calculate her vulnerability based on who was watching. She had shed the skin of the woman who desperately sought validation, whose identity was inextricably linked to the approval of people who had deemed her unworthy of honesty. Professionally, she was thriving. Using the skills she had quietly honed during her marriage, skills Daniel had only utilized to benefit his own enterprises, she launched a small boutique consulting firm specializing in strategic market entry. She took only the clients she chose, working from her loft with absolute autonomy. The irony was exquisite. She was successful precisely because she was no longer operating under Daniel's controlling shadow or Olivia's envious scrutiny. Her confidence stemmed from her own capability, not from the brittle external validation of her peers or family. She ran her hand over the polished wood of her desk. She was rereading a legal brief, not out of necessity, but out of interest. The case surrounding the nullification of the fraudulently signed divorce decree, the very fraud that had sparked her liberation, was now something she could look at objectively. It wasn't a source of trauma. It was a testament to her victory. She rarely thought of Daniel. He had settled into the comfortable silence of irrelevance. He was still maneuvering in his business world, still insulated by his fortune and his ego, but he was no longer a factor in her orbit. The thought of him elicited nothing more than mild pity, a weak man who required an aggressive sister to do his dirty work. Olivia was the scar that required more vigilance. Clara knew deep down that Olivia was incapable of change. Her malice was her operating system. The silence between them was a thick, protective shield. There were occasional breaches, forwarded emails from extended family gossip chains that she instantly archived, or once, a generic, unsigned Christmas card that had arrived at Mr. Davies' office and was promptly forwarded to Clara's secure, anonymized P.O. box. This morning, there was a quiet echo of the past. Her phone buzzed, alerting her to a text message from an unfamiliar number. It wasn't signed, but the content held the unmistakable tone of her mother. "We heard you might be doing well. That's good. We want to believe things can mend, Clara. Life is short. Please just let us know you're safe. Your sister is struggling right now and needs family support." Clara stared at the message. The language was perfect. The subtle guilt trip, the implied forgiveness she was supposed to be seeking, and the immediate deflection to Olivia's needs. Olivia is struggling. Of course she was. Without Clara to manipulate, and without Daniel's partnership in malice, Olivia was forced to confront the vacuum of her own life. A year ago, that text message would have sent Clara into a spiral of guilt, obligation, and anxiety. She would have drafted replies, agonizing over the perfect balance of self-defense and familial deference. Today, she simply pressed and held the notification, marking the number as spam and deleting the message without opening the thread. The act was swift, unemotional, and absolute. There was no debate in her mind, no lingering ache of obligation. She had chosen herself, and the boundary she had erected was not permeable. Her safety, her peace, and her self-worth were no longer negotiable. She turned away from the desk, moving toward the kitchen counter where the coffee had finished dripping. She poured herself a cup, walked to the large window overlooking the bustling street below, and inhaled the steam. The truth had been crushing, yes. The knowledge that the person she had entrusted with her life, Daniel, and the person she was genetically bound to, Olivia, were united in their desire to professionally and emotionally annihilate her was a trauma that she would always carry. But the trauma no longer defined her. She lifted the cup in a silent, solitary toast. She had faced the darkest parts of her history, excised the rot, and rebuilt a life founded on the unvarnished reality of who she was, Clara Maeve, a woman who had been betrayed, survived, and ultimately flourished in the cold, clean light of self-liberation. She was free not just from them, but from the need to be accepted by them. That freedom, she knew, was the greatest inheritance of all.